"Is she proud of you?" the billionaire asked with a thin smile. "Or does she tell her friends her father is just a waiter?" The whole table went quiet. Marcus set the bottle down slowly. "Mock me again," he said. "I dare you." What she had no way of knowing was that the man standing over her, the one she had spent the entire night humiliating, held the one piece of information that could end her career before the sun came up. And in less than a minute, he was going to use it. Stay with me, because you have not heard anything like this before. The restaurant was called Aldrich House, the kind of place where the lighting was dim on purpose and the wine list had no prices printed on it. Marcus Bell had worked the floor there for 4 years, and in that time he had learned exactly how to move through a room full of people who would never remember his name. He carried plates the way other men carried certainty, steady hands, no wasted motion, a calm that made nervous guests feel like the evening was under control, even when it wasn't. His manager, Curtis, used to joke that Marcus could talk a man out of sending back a perfectly good steak just by the tone of his voice. "Curtis," he said once, leaning against the kitchen doorway with his arms crossed, "you ever think about doing something else with that brain of yours?" Marcus had just smiled and kept stacking plates. "This is fine for now," he told him. Now was doing a lot of work in that sentence, and Curtis knew it, but he never pushed. What none of the diners at Aldrich House knew, and what Marcus rarely let himself think about during a shift, was that 7 years earlier he had been an engineer. Not just any engineer. He had been the lead architect behind a piece of financial forecasting software that 3 different banks had once tried to buy the rights to. He built systems the way some men build houses, from the foundation up, every piece tested twice before it ever saw daylight. Then his daughter, Zoe, 3 years old at the time, had gotten sick. Not a cold, not a fever that passed in a week, a heart condition that required 2 surgeries and a hospital stay that drained every account he had and then some. His wife Renee had held his hand in a hospital hallway while he signed away his equity in the company he built, trading the thing he was proudest of for the thing he could not live without. He never once regretted it. Zoe lived. She grew. She learned to ride a bike in the parking lot behind their apartment building, falling 4 times before she finally got it right, laughing so hard she could barely breathe by the 5th try. 3 years ago, Renee lost a battle of her own, quiet and fast in a way that still didn't feel real some mornings. Since then, it had just been the 2 of them, Marcus and Zoe, in a small apartment in Queens with a kitchen table that wobbled if you leaned on it wrong. He chose the restaurant job on purpose. Predictable hours, steady pay. No late nights chasing investors, no phone calls that stole him away from bedtime stories. He had built one empire already and lost it to save his daughter's life. He wasn't interested in building another one at her expense. That was the life Marcus had made peace with, right up until the night Vanessa Cole walked through the front doors of Aldrich House. Vanessa was 43, the founder and chief executive of a company called Solvane, a name that had been on the cover of 3 business magazines in the last year alone. She arrived with her chief of staff, a sharp, quiet woman named Diane, and 4 members of her leadership team, all of them there to celebrate the final approval of a product launch that had taken 18 months and more money than most people would see in a lifetime. Vanessa had built something real, that part was true. Solvane had gone from a garage idea to a company worth billions, and she had done it with a relentlessness that made people either admire her or fear her, sometimes both in the same breath.
But somewhere along the way, admiration had curdled into something else. She had stopped hearing the word no. She had stopped noticing when the people around her flinched. She decided within the first minute that Marcus was beneath her notice. She never once used his name, even after he introduced himself with a warm, practiced smile. "Thank you," she said instead. "Waiter." Just waiter. The way someone might say chair or table, a word for a function instead of a person.
When Marcus offered a recommendation from the wine list, something dry and full-bodied that would sit well with the tasting menu, she cut him off before he finished the sentence. "Actually," she said, smiling at her table like she was about to perform a trick, "let's test him. Name 3 vintages from the Loire Valley that aren't on this list." Diane shifted slightly in her seat. One of the men across the table let out a short, uncomfortable laugh, unsure if it was a joke or not. Marcus answered calmly, correctly, without missing a beat, and without a trace of defensiveness in his voice. He watched Vanessa's smile falter for just a second, like she had been expecting him to stumble and was almost annoyed that he hadn't. "You speak awfully well," she said, loud enough for the whole table to hear, "for someone doing this job." A few of her team exchanged a glance, the kind of glance people give each other when they understand exactly what was just implied and choose not to say anything about it. Diane looked down at her napkin. Marcus refilled a water glass 2 seats down, his jaw tight, his hands perfectly steady. "This is fine," he told himself. "This is just a Tuesday." He had said that sentence to himself 100 times before, and it had always worked. Tonight, it was starting not to. Vanessa kept going, because his calm seemed to bother her more than any mistake would have. She asked how many shifts a man his age would need to work to afford shoes like hers. She said, almost gently, that she had met people like him before, people who spend one evening in a nice room and start imagining they belong there. A man closing in on 40, she said, taking a slow sip of wine, should be grateful just to be allowed inside a place like this at all. Marcus said nothing. He poured. He straightened a fork that didn't need straightening. He breathed. Then Vanessa asked the question that changed everything. "Do you have kids?" she asked, tilting her head like she was genuinely curious. "I do," he said quietly. "A daughter, 10 years old." Vanessa leaned back in her chair. "Is she proud of you?" she asked. "Or does she tell her friends her father is just a waiter?" "I only ask because I wonder sometimes what we teach our children when we settle, whether they learn to expect the world owes them something, or whether they learn to actually earn a life worth having." The table went still. Diane's eyes flicked up sharply like she wanted to say something and physically stopped herself. Marcus set the wine bottle down on the table, slowly, deliberately. The sound of glass meeting linen the only thing that broke the silence at that table. "Mock me again," he said, his voice low and even. "I dare you." Vanessa smiled, the expression of someone who believed she had finally gotten the reaction she'd been hunting all night. "Let's not turn your unprofessionalism into a conversation about prejudice," she said smoothly. "I treat every member of staff exactly the same." "No," Marcus answered, his voice steady. "You treat everyone badly. You just choose certain people to look down on more than others." Forks stopped moving. Someone near the end of the table cleared his throat, reaching for a tablet propped near Vanessa's elbow, angling it to show her something on the screen. And in that small motion, the device turned just enough that Marcus, standing a step behind her shoulder, caught a clear look at what was on it. A diagram. Blue and white lines laid out in a structure he recognized the way you recognize your own handwriting. Data architecture. Forecasting logic. He had seen that exact shape before, because 7 years ago he had drawn it,
on a whiteboard in a garage office at 2 in the morning, back when the company was just him and 2 other engineers and a pot of burnt coffee.
He said nothing. He finished pouring water at the next table over, unhurried, giving himself time to look again without appearing to look at all. What caught his eye wasn't the branding or the sleek interface layered on top for the investors. It was a single internal module name tucked into the corner of the diagram, a name he had coined himself 7 years earlier, back when that forecasting engine was still just lines of code on his laptop and a promise he'd made to build something that actually worked. This was not a coincidence. This was his work, sitting inside a presentation that Vanessa Cole was about to call her greatest achievement. He circled back, refilled 2 more glasses, and let his eyes drift to the screen a second time, longer now, confirming what he'd already known the first time. The data layers were stacked exactly the way he had stacked them. A particular variable sat exactly where he had placed it, doing exactly the job he built it to do. Only once he was certain did he speak, and when he did, his tone carried no threat in it at all, just the flat, quiet confidence of a man stating a fact. The system, as shown, he said, will overreact to short-term market swings. It will misallocate resources at scale under exactly the wrong conditions. There's a failure point buried inside that design that could cascade into something much larger. If it isn't fixed before launch, your biggest contract could collapse within the first quarter. Vanessa went quiet in a way that had nothing to do with composure, because the 3 problems Marcus had just described calmly in front of her entire leadership team were the exact 3 problems her engineering department had spent months trying to quietly bury, the ones she had been personally assured were under control. Diane looked at Marcus now with an expression that had shifted from discomfort into something closer to disbelief. Vanessa recovered fast, snapping back into the voice she used in boardrooms. She turned to Curtis, who had come over to check on the table, and demanded he fire Marcus on the spot, threatening to pull every future event Solvane held with the restaurant's parent company. Curtis didn't blink. With respect, he said calmly, he only spoke after being provoked. I watched the whole thing. And later that night, without telling anyone why, he quietly pulled the dining room security footage and saved a copy to his personal drive. By the next morning, Vanessa had already begun digging into the background of a waiter she had never once bothered to learn the name of. What she found stopped her cold. Marcus Bell had been the founding architect of a forecasting platform that Solvane had quietly acquired years ago and folded into the foundation of its new product. His existence, she understood immediately, threatened everything. The story she told investors, the image of a self-made visionary, the legacy she had built around technology that was never entirely hers to claim. Driving home that night, Marcus sat in his car outside his apartment building for a long moment before going inside. He thought about the ease with which Vanessa had delivered every insult, like she'd rehearsed that particular cruelty on 100 other people who never happened to have a diagram to catch her with. He thought about Renee and the things she used to tell him. Dignity isn't something you have to prove to a room, she'd say. It's something you refuse to let a room take from you. Inside, Zoe was already asleep on the couch, a half-finished math worksheet still resting on her lap. He carried her to bed the way he had 1,000 nights before, careful not to wake her, careful to keep his hands from shaking. He sat in the dark kitchen afterward for a long time. 7 years he'd spent building a life where nobody asked about his old company. That anonymity had felt like safety. Vanessa Cole had just made that safety very hard to hold on to. By the time Marcus woke the next morning, the story had already outgrown the dining room where it started. A clip had surfaced online, 11 seconds long. It began at the exact moment he set the bottle down and spoke, and it ended right after the word dare. Everything Vanessa had said before that moment, every comment about her age, her daughter, her shoes, had been cut away completely. The clip spread the way clips like that always spread, fast and without any context at all. Commentators who had never sat at that table described him as an aggressive employee, a disgruntled man looking for attention. News anchors repeated the framing without questioning it once. Vanessa appeared in front of cameras that afternoon with the composed sorrow of someone who had rehearsed grief in a mirror. "It's unfortunate," she said, her voice soft and careful, "that an ordinary disagreement over service has been twisted into something about race. I take no pleasure in seeing a working man's reputation suffer, but businesses have an obligation to protect their people from threatening behavior." In 4 sentences, she made herself the injured party and turned a man who had stood perfectly still into someone the public should fear. That evening, Zoe found Marcus sitting at the kitchen table, staring at his phone. "Dad," she asked quietly, "is it true, what they're saying online?" Marcus set the phone face down. "No," he said gently. "She asked me things about you first, baby, before I ever said a word back to her. Nobody online is showing that part. But you know me, and I need you to trust what you know over what a stranger's video says." Zoe nodded slowly, believing him the way she always believed him, without needing anything more than the calm certainty in his voice. "Is it because we're not rich like her?" she asked, her voice smaller than before. Marcus knelt down in front of her chair. "It's not about money at all," he said. "Some people decide who matters before they ever learn anything true about them. That has nothing to do with what our family does or doesn't have. You hear me?" She nodded again and hugged him, and Marcus held on to her a little longer than usual that night, because something in him understood that whatever happened next wasn't only about his own dignity anymore. 2 days later, Diane called and asked to meet somewhere quiet, away from anyone who reported to Vanessa. She found Marcus on a bench outside a small park near his apartment, and before he could say anything, she apologized for her silence at that dinner. "I understood exactly what was happening in real time," she admitted, her voice tight, "and I chose the deal over speaking up. That's a lie I needed to hear less than you needed to hear the truth." Marcus didn't soften the moment for her. "You didn't stay quiet because you didn't understand," he said. "You stayed quiet because the contract mattered more to my dignity did, right up until it stopped being convenient not to notice." Diane had no answer for that, and to her credit, she didn't try to manufacture one. She sat with it. "Prejudice doesn't only live in the words of the person doing the insulting," Marcus added, quieter now. "It lives just as easily in the silence of people who know something is wrong and decide speaking up is too inconvenient." She offered him a job at her own firm, something with a real title behind it. Marcus turned it down without hesitation. "I don't need a better version of what happened at that dinner, where you finally notice me once you find out I'm worth something on paper. I need people to see value in a man carrying trays the same way they'd see it in a man carrying a title." Diane accepted the correction, and something between them shifted from guilt into something closer to partnership. She began quietly reviewing old company records, starting with the version history on the forecasting platform, looking for anything that could prove what Marcus already knew to be true. What she found was suggestive but incomplete. Fragments of old code that hinted at an older origin without proving who built it first. She needed something more specific. That's when Marcus told her for the first time out loud about the fingerprint he had left behind in the original build 7 years earlier.
Buried deep inside the forecasting module was a small piece of test code,
a validation string he had written the same week Zoe turned 3. He had named it after a phrase she used to repeat constantly back then. 3 words she said every time something excited her, back when she was just learning to speak in full sentences. It was, he admitted quietly, the same week he had signed away his company inside that hospital hallway. He'd written the string almost without thinking, needing something of hers close to the work, even as he was preparing to let the work go. No public documentation described it. No outside engineer would ever think to look for it. Only the person who wrote it would know it existed at all. Diane traced it, spending long nights after work combing through archived repositories. Nobody at Solvane expected an outsider to examine that closely. Within days, she had built a case far more solid than either of them had started with. Commit logs with his name buried in them, never fully scrubbed. Design documents matching his description down to the smallest naming convention. Hospital records confirming the timeline of his equity sale lined up exactly with Zoe's surgery. Internal emails showing engineers had flagged the same 3 flaws Marcus named at dinner month after month, quietly closed out by senior leadership without resolution. And messages proving Vanessa herself had received those warnings directly and kept calling the platform her singular achievement anyway. Diane wanted to release everything immediately. Marcus stopped her. "I'm not interested in becoming a supporting character in a fight the public frames as 2 powerful women, while I get erased a second time in the retelling. If we do this, I tell my own story in my own words, and nobody speaks for me." That fragile plan barely survived the week. Vanessa's communications team leaked a report accusing Marcus of abandoning his old company during a critical growth period, framing his exit as a self-interested move instead of a father's desperate choice. It never mentioned a hospital, never mentioned a 3-year-old girl waiting on a surgical table. Corporate clients started canceling events at Aldridge House. Curtis absorbed the financial hit as long as he could, then had no choice but to cut hours for coworkers who had nothing to do with it. Marcus resigned before Curtis ever had to consider letting him go. "You've done nothing but protect me," he told him, setting his apron on the desk. "I won't let that cost the people who work here." The damage reached further than the restaurant. A landlord who had agreed to rent Marcus a small storefront for a restaurant of his own, something he'd been quietly saving toward for 3 years, backed out within a week, citing vague liability concerns after reading the articles. 3 years of saving, gone over a single phone call. Then came the lowest point. A reporter tracked down Zoe's school and got close enough to approach her during recess, firing questions faster than a 10-year-old could process. "Does your father hate her? Is someone paying your family to say this? Are you using race to get money?" Zoe panicked and ran, cutting across the sidewalk without checking for traffic, the way Marcus had warned her 100 times never to do. She wasn't hit. The tires braked hard enough to stop just short of her, tears screaming against the pavement, but she wasn't hurt, not physically. Marcus got the call and arrived to find her shaking on the sidewalk, a stranger's hand resting awkwardly on her shoulder, trying to keep her calm. He carried her home, wrapped in his coat, her small body trembling the entire ride. That night, after she finally fell asleep, he pulled the folded blueprint for his restaurant out of the closet and packed it into a box, along with a few other things. If he just disappeared, he told himself, Vanessa would have no one left to attack. Zoe found him packing that box before bed. "If she's the one lying," she asked, standing in the doorway in her pajamas, "why does she get to decide that we're the ones who have to leave?" Marcus had no answer for her that night. The next morning, he found the blueprint sitting exactly where he'd left it, except now something was written across the back in careful, uneven 10-year-old handwriting. A few words crossed out and rewritten until she got it right. "The place where Dad never bows to anyone," it read.
He stood in the kitchen holding it for a long time. Then he called Diane, and then he called Curtis. "Told you to call me first," Curtis said. Now tell me what you need." Marcus agreed to accept their help, but kept the same conditions from the start. Diane would verify and distribute the evidence. Curtis would provide the full, unedited footage. Marcus himself would be the one to speak, in his own words, and the goal was never going to be revenge. Just the truth, spoken plainly, and whatever accountability followed it. Sylvain held its official launch event inside a glass ballroom filled with board members, investors, and financial press. Vanessa walked onto that stage intending to call the platform the greatest achievement of her career. And for a few minutes, under lights built to make her look untouchable, she almost believed her own story again. Behind the scenes, the quiet machinery Marcus had agreed to was already moving. Diane had sent verified documents to board members known for asking hard questions rather than following Vanessa's lead. Marcus's name had been added to the guest list through a contact who owed Diane a favor. Curtis had already transferred the unedited footage to a handful of phones inside that room, timing it so it would land quietly. Vanessa spotted Marcus's name on the list before the doors even opened. She revoked his access immediately, locked down the main presentation system, and ordered security to remove him the moment he showed up. When Marcus walked through the entrance in a plain gray suit, security closed in within seconds, hands already reaching for his arm. Vanessa seized the moment, turning to the room. "This man threatened me once already," she announced, "and now he's trying to force his way into a private event." Marcus didn't raise his voice, and he didn't pull away from the hands gripping his arm. "Did you ever see me as an engineer?" he asked, loud enough to carry across the room, "before you knew my name?" Vanessa said nothing. Her expression flickered for just a second before she smoothed it back into composure. "When I wore a uniform," Marcus continued, "you decided I couldn't understand technology. When I pushed back against being insulted, you called me dangerous. When the evidence proved I built this platform, you called me a bitter man looking for attention." He turned slightly toward the board members near the front. "The problem was never that she didn't know who I was," he said. "The problem is she decided who I was allowed to be the moment she looked at me." Security began moving him toward the exit. Then an investor near the front stood up, one of the people who had already received Diane's documents that week, and asked the room to let him finish. Another guest confirmed openly that the materials circulating did appear authentic. A ripple of uncertainty passed through the crowd, one Vanessa could feel even from the stage. Marcus began speaking from memory, calm and precise, naming the original module structure, describing how data moved through the system's core layers, explaining design choices he'd made years earlier when the platform was still just code on his own laptop. He described the same 3 flaws he'd named at that dinner, and then, for the first time in public, he mentioned the small validation string buried inside the forecasting module, the one named after a phrase his daughter used to say when she was 3.
An engineer sitting near the back of the room straightened in his seat, recognizing every detail as accurate technical language no outsider could have faked. Vanessa tried to regain control, insisting Marcus had sold the company and surrendered every right to it the moment he signed those papers, accusing him of clinging to a past that no longer belonged to him. Marcus let her finish without interrupting. Then he told the room plainly that he had signed the sale of his company inside a hospital hallway while his daughter waited 2 floors up for emergency heart surgery. "I lost a company," he said. "I kept my daughter. If I had to choose again tomorrow, I'd sign those same papers without hesitation." "Nobody came to hear a waiter's personal story," Vanessa snapped, and the words landed wrong the instant they left her mouth, the room shifting almost visibly around her. Diane, standing near the side of the ballroom, confirmed quietly that the documents had already reached the entire board. Curtis, watching from the back, sent the full, unedited footage to phones throughout the room within seconds. Vanessa could lock the main screen. She couldn't lock every device in a room full of investors already reaching for their phones.
Within minutes, the footage was playing silently across dozens of small screens at once. Guests watched her refuse to use his name, watched her express open surprise that he could speak intelligently about business, watched her bring his 10-year-old daughter into an insult meant only to wound him. A board member called for the main screen to be unlocked, and after a tense moment, someone complied. The footage played across the central display for the whole room. The original design documents appeared next, projected beside it, and Marcus turned to Vanessa and asked her directly to explain the 3 structural flaws in a platform she'd spent months calling her personal achievement. She reached for corporate language, vague phrases about risk tolerance and market responsiveness. Marcus pressed further into the specific mechanics, and she had no answer that held together under any real scrutiny. The engineers stood then and confirmed, in front of the entire room, that Marcus understood the platform's architecture better than anyone currently employed by the company, and that internal warnings about exactly these flaws had been raised and ignored months earlier. Vanessa said nothing after that. For the first time in her career, money, position, and assumption failed to decide who deserved to be believed in that room. The board suspended the launch before the morning ended. Vanessa was placed on administrative leave pending a full investigation. Within days, Sylvain formally acknowledged Marcus as the platform's original architect and offered him a substantial royalty agreement. He turned down an offer to return as chief technology officer, telling Diane privately that he had no interest in inheriting an empire built on his own work. Vanessa lost her position once the board confirmed she knew the technology's true origins and kept building her public reputation on a story she understood to be false. Nobody framed her downfall as a woman losing to a man, and Marcus made a point of correcting anyone who suggested otherwise. She was held accountable for looking down on a person because of his race and his job, for erasing another man's work, and for turning the person she wronged into the one who appeared guilty. Sylvain committed publicly to transparent crediting of employee contributions and a full review of its hiring and promotion practices.
Marcus used part of his royalty agreement to set up a fund for Zoe's future, and the rest to finally open the small storefront he thought he'd lost for good. He didn't call it anything fancy, just a modest place with an open kitchen, a small table in the corner where Zoe did her homework most evenings, and a staff he made sure was treated fairly from day one. Above the staff station, he hung a single line, painted simply on the wall. No one who walks into this room is smaller than anyone else in it. He still worked the floor himself some evenings, greeting customers by name, not because he needed the money anymore, but because he wanted Zoe to understand that the work itself had never made him small. One evening, setting the table together, Zoe asked if Vanessa was a bad person. Marcus thought about it honestly before answering. She did wrong things, and she had to answer for them, he said. But hating her isn't the point, sweetheart. The point is that we don't become like her. How do we avoid that? Zoe asked. You look at people before their skin, their uniform, their money, or their title, he told her, and you speak up whenever someone else is being made to feel small, even when speaking up costs something. Vanessa once believed power meant the ability to make other people go silent. Marcus proved that real power was standing against injustice without letting anger turn him into the very thing he was fighting. Prejudice doesn't always announce itself loudly. Sometimes it lives quietly in assumptions, in glances, in the casual certainty of someone who has already decided who deserves to be heard. Fighting it was never about revenge. It was about bringing the truth into the light, demanding accountability, and building something better for whoever walked through the door next. If this story moved you tonight, if it reminded you that quiet dignity can outlast even the loudest cruelty, do one small thing before you go. hit subscribe and stay close for the next story, because there are so many more people out there who never bowed to anyone, and their stories deserve to be told too. Thank you for watching until the very end.